Hi there, if you're new here, my name is Luisa, but everybody calls me Lu, and welcome to today's video where I talk about how I avoid knitting regrets, or at least the things I do to help me avoid them. I think most knitting regrets don't happen because we don't know how to knit. They happen because we make a decision that seems perfectly reasonable at the time, and only realize much later that it wasn't the right decision for us. And I'm definitely not an expert. I learned to knit by watching lots and lots of YouTube videos, making mistakes and experimenting until I figured out what I like and what I don't. So many of the things I'm going to talk about today, I learned the hard way. But after years of knitting, I finally feel like I'm at a point where I can picture a project in my head and have a pretty good chance of ending up with exactly what I hoped. Now, do I still sometimes knit something that makes me question all my life choices? Of course I do. My porcelain sweater is right over there looking at me right now. I can feel it. So I wanted to share some of the mindset changes that have helped me over the years. Not because I think they are the only right way to do things, but because they helped me make better decisions before I cast on or even during a project. We'll talk about everything from choosing colors, yarn, knowing when to frog, and how I think about experimenting with new projects. Hopefully, they'll make your knitting journey a little easier and a little more satisfying than mine was in those first few years. And while we are chatting, I need to make a swatch for my next project. I'm hoping to cast on the Midland cardigan by Laura Penrose, and I had a swatch already done and ready to block until I realized I had knitted in stockinette stitch and the Midland cardigan is worked in garter stitch. So while I remake my swatch, we'll talk about all of this. The first thing I learned the really hard way was to make decisions early, but don't be afraid to change them. And the first thing I do when I'm getting ready to cast on a project is browse through Reverie. Let me just count to see if I have 10 reps. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10. Usually when I'm deciding on my next project, I have a pretty good idea of the color I want, but sometimes I don't. And in those cases, I look through other people's projects on Reverie to see what colors they used, what I like, what I don't like, and if the color I have in mind will look good for a certain project. But while I do that, I'm also reading through other people's notes on their project pages. And I'm looking for information like, oh, the fit is weird, the color was too tight, I had to modify this or that, I added length to the sleeves. Any sort of modification or issue they faced along the project so that I feel better prepared for when I'm actually casting on. And I have one extra stitch. Yeah, here we go. So I'm looking for all kinds of modifications that people might have made to their projects, and I think this reduces the chance of ripping back or regretting a color, for example. And that leads me to, I always keep an eye on what's happening next in the pattern. That is especially important when I'm still working on the yoke of a top-down sweater, for example. I am very particular about the fit I want for my garments, so when I'm still working on the yoke, I usually keep an eye on many things at the same time, but especially the armhole depth, because usually I shorten the yoke of my garments. That's just personal preference. But if I'm still working on the yoke, sometimes depending on the pattern, right before separating for the sleeves, for example, there's a small section of raglan shaping to improve the fit, let's say. And if I don't know that I'm going to do raglan shaping in the future and I need to shorten my yoke, by the time I am done with the raglan shaping and I want to shorten it, I'll have to rip back the shaping to remove a few rows and then redo the raglan shaping. So yeah, it's just extra work and extra unnecessary work, that is. So I usually keep an eye out on what's ahead of me so that I can better prepare any possible modifications or any changes that I want to make to my project. And also I learned that I prefer not to wait too long to try it on. That is especially important when I'm in the initial stages of a new sweater project or any kind of top-down project, because like I said, I'm very particular with the fit of my garments. So I'm always trying things on, especially before I move on to another section in the pattern. Let's say I think I'm ready to separate for the sleeves. So I try it on. I think I'm ready to start the hem of a sweater. I try it on before I switch to 2x2 ribbing. Because that way, if something is not looking as I expected and I'm doing the wrong stitch again, okay, let me just repack this row. But as I was saying, that way, if something is not looking as expected, I have less work to rip back, and I think that makes my life easier a little bit. My first sweater projects I didn't try on as much, and the fit is just not really what I wanted. I mean, they are good, but I know I could have done better, and that would have been avoided had I just tried them on more often. And I am lost. Oh, okay. So moving on. I not only try on my projects very often, but I also do frequent mid-project blocks. And that is kind of tied to trying things on, because I also like to do a mid-project block before I move to a important section in the pattern. For example, if I am separating for the sleeves, before I start the hem, and also when I'm like 2/3 of the way into a sleeve, I always like to do a mid-project block because things change. The fabric changes, the stitch definition gets sometimes better, sometimes worse, and the fit changes a lot, usually with a good soak. So that way I know what to expect when my project is ready, and if something is bothering me, I have less work ahead of me by discovering the issue now instead of after binding off all my stitches. Because that sure has happened to me a couple of times over the years. Which reminds me of gauge swatch, which is what I'm doing right now. For the second time, that is. But I always do a gauge swatch when I'm getting ready to cast on a garment. I don't usually swatch for winter accessories or cushions or any other kind of project. Like I just finished this cushion that is behind me today, and I didn't really swatch for that because size isn't that important. But I find it really important when it comes to garments, so I always swatch for garment projects. And I swatch, but I don't trust my swatch. That's what I've learned over the years. So why do I swatch? Well, I want to see my gauge information, obviously, but I also swatch to see the fabric. Does this fabric look good with the yarn I plan on using? Do I like my stitch definition, the needle size I chose? Do I want to go up or down a needle size? How the fabric behaves after a good soak, and all of those things. So I swatch, but I don't trust my swatch when it comes to my gauge. I trust when I'm looking at the fabric, if that makes any sense. So one other thing that I've learned is to, and I keep wanting to knit stockinette. Okay, I have a feeling I'm going to redo this swatch a third time, but anyway. As I was saying, when it comes to gauge, I find really important to keep track of my progress in those first stages of a new project. For example, if it's a top-down sweater, I'm always keeping track of my gauge while I'm still working on the yoke, especially before doing the first mid-project block. I usually do a mid-project block like 2 or 3 times throughout a project if it's a long-sleeved sweater. But before blocking the yoke of my project, I'm always measuring my gauge, just to see if everything is on track, if it matches my swatch, if I need to add a couple of increases or shorten my yoke, add a few rows here, remove a few rows there, and all of those things. And this is something I've learned the really hard way. And usually when I trust my swatch when it comes to gauge, I end up regretting that, which leads me to, when in doubt, frock. This is maybe the most important tip I guess I would share with any knitter out there. This is what I've learned from my experience, okay? Maybe you have a different experience with your knitting, but what I learned is that if I'm not sure about something, then just frog it. Because if I really liked, let's say, the length of my sweater, I wouldn't doubt it. I would be sure of it. So if I'm in doubt, just frog it. Yes. The few times that I persevered, let's say, and tried to, oh, let's see what happens. Maybe I will end up liking the length. I regretted it, and by the time I realized that I didn't like the length, my stitches were bound off, my ends were woven in, and I just had way more work ahead of me to fix this length issue. So if I could share just one tip, it would be, when in doubt, frog. And this is something that happened when I was working on my Madeleine sweater that is right behind me over there. I don't think you can see it, but anyway. When I was working on the body of that sweater, there was a top-down construction. I was halfway through a row and I stopped and started thinking about the length. Do I like this length? I don't know. So I transferred all my stitches to a try-on tubing, looked in the mirror, was still unsure about the length, transferred everything back to my needles and continued knitting. Every now and then I would stop mid-row and think about the length. Do I like it? Oh, I don't know. Is it looking good? I don't know. That is my sign. I already know this. I learned this the hard way. That is my sign to change something. If I really liked it, I would be sure of it. So if I'm always coming back to this, let's say, issue, I know it's better to frog and fix whatever it is. And I know the fear of going off script is strong, but every time you finish a project and you've made a modification that works, it's such a boost of confidence that, well, it's just so rewarding and I feel so good that I really recommend to every knitter out there. And there's also one thing that I always think about when I'm making a modification on a pattern, which is once you cast something on, you are the designer. I'm not saying to steal someone else's work. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is everybody has different body types and usually the designers doesn't really match your body type, or at least that's my case almost 100% of the time. So I always find myself having to make some little adjustments like length, yoke depth and other things to make it better fit the idea I have in my head. Everybody has different body types, so we need to adjust our garments to better fit our bodies. We need to make the pattern work for us, and I think that's a really good thing. Which brings me to a tip I received from a viewer, I think a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she usually needs one size for the back of her sweaters and a larger size for the front, so that way it better suits her body type. And I think that is so smart. I would have never thought of that. I want to keep this in the back of my head for future projects. I usually do this when I'm working on a sleeve, when I'm picking up stitches for a sleeve, for example. Many times I need one size for the body and a larger size for the sleeve, but I have never thought about doing that on the body of my sweaters. But moving on, another thing that I learned was to knit for my life and not the life I wish I had, or at least my day-to-day life. And what do I mean by that? I choose colors that I love. That's not always the case, but most times it is, because by doing that, I have a higher chance of ending up with something that I will wear in the end. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't jump on trends without thinking first. And I'm talking about myself here. My yarn is potentially becoming a mess, but I will make it work somehow. Anyway, don't jump on trends without thinking first. That's a hard lesson I learned over the years. And that is valid for colors, for yarns, for patterns, for basically any decision I need to make when it comes to my knitting projects. Because if I don't like the color everybody else is using, I know I'm not gonna wear it. Like a while back, everybody was knitting with butter yellow. I don't really like yellow, so I've never jumped on that trend. Maybe I missed something, maybe I didn't, I don't know. but I worked on things that made me really happy and I wear them, so everything is fine in the end. But keep in mind, this is from the perspective of someone who finds a product need as important as a process need. So I want to have fun with my projects while I'm still working on them, but I want to end up with something that I will wear as well. Because if I don't wear my projects once they are done, I always feel like I wasted money and time and yarn, and all of that effort went to nothing. And this is just my opinion and the way I approach my knitting. I'm not saying you have to agree with me, I'm not saying that at all. Maybe you just value a process in it and you want to have fun with your projects. You don't really care about wearing them in the end, and that is perfectly fine. If that makes you happy, go for it. But in my case, I need to wear them. That's why I talked about colors and why I overthink everything so much before casting on a new project. And that leads me to knits should complement your wardrobe, or my wardrobe at least, not reinvent it. Because if I work on something that gives me a lot of joy, like a process knit, good, perfect, everything is great. But if I end up with something that I know I'm not going to wear because it doesn't fit my everyday life, because I have nowhere to wear it, then I also regret this project in the end. And that reminds me of a sequin dress that I've been itching to cast on for such a long time, but I still haven't done it because I have nowhere to go that would require me to wear a sequin dress. But they are so gorgeous. So I really think I would have fun working on said dress, but I know I'm not going to wear it. It will probably just collect dust in my closet, so I will end up regretting it later on. So that's why I never cast it on, but I so want to. That's what I mean by knit for your life and not the life you wish you had, because I really wish I had somewhere to go that would require a sequin dress. That would be really fun. And actually, there's another thing that I almost knit the wrong stitch again. Okay, moving on. So that also reminds me of something else, which is ease. Let's talk about ease for a little bit. It's my opinion that the recommended ease doesn't matter. What matters is the fit you want for your project. So let's say a pattern recommends 20 centimeters of positive ease, but I know I don't like to wear my sweaters with so much positive ease. I usually like to keep my ease around 10 to 12 centimeters. So that's what I do. I just ignore the recommended ease. And most times I don't even know what the recommended ease is for the pattern I'm working on, because I just make a decision based on what I know I like and the fit I have in mind. Sometimes I want to go with more ease than what the pattern recommends. Sometimes I want to go with less ease. So I base my decision on my likes and dislikes and my wardrobe. For example, if I want to wear a sweater with a skirt, I shorten the length a little bit. That isn't really about ease, but you get what I mean. I try to picture how I would style it, how I would wear it, because I find that if I just stick to what the pattern recommends, there's a high chance that I will regret it in the end. So I adapt everything. And now let's move on to another lesson that I learned, which is make smarter yarn decisions. I don't have a script for today's video, by the way. I just have some very loose topics of the things I want to talk about, so I have no idea if this is coming across as very confusing ideas, but I hope everything makes sense. So make smarter yarn decisions. Yes. What do I mean by that? First of all, I always choose good yarn for my projects. Otherwise, I know I will regret my decision in the end. And by good yarn, I don't mean expensive yarn. There's a difference. Good yarn, in my opinion, is something that I like how it feels next to skin. I like the texture of the ball of yarn when I squish it. and I like my stitch definition, I like how it holds up over time and all of those things. That doesn't mean that it comes with a pretty expensive price tag. For example, I'm working on this tee here, this striped tee that I just cast on yesterday, so there isn't much to show you yet. But I'm using cotton yarn for this project. This is 100% cotton, and each bow of this yarn cost me less than €3. That is really cheap for 160 meters of, I think this is fingering weight. But in my opinion, this is good yarn. Why? I like the stitch definition, I like the texture, how the fabric is behaving so far at least, how my stripes look, my stitches look even, and all of those things. Will this hold up over time? I have no idea because it's my first time knitting with this yarn, but so far this is good yarn for me. And like I said, I've paid less than €3 for each bow of that yarn. When you compare to this one, for example, each skein of this yarn cost around, I think, €15, so it's way more expensive, and at least so far it's not as soft as that cotton yarn. I know this is wool and that is cotton, so I have to take that into account. But I'm thinking about a project that I worked on last year, my Belle and Sebastian pullover. I chose a yarn that I didn't like, but I bought it online, so I only found out that I didn't like the texture of it once I had it in my hands, which leads me to buy yarn in person whenever possible. In my case, that it's almost never possible because I live in a pretty small town and we don't have any yarn shops here. We just have a craft store that sells a little bit of everything and nothing at the same time, if that makes any sense. So most times I can't find what I'm looking for at this store, so I end up buying most of my yarn online. So I don't get to see how it feels next to your skin, and I also don't get to see the color in person, which I think makes a lot of difference when buying yarn. So I would recommend, whenever possible, buy yarn in person. That way you have less of a chance of regretting your choices in the future, because that is certainly what happened when I was working on this Belle and Sebastian pullover that I mentioned. I chose a yarn that was like medium priced, and I really didn't like the texture of it once I opened the box, but I had already bought the yarn, so I didn't want to return it. I wanted to cast on my project, so I just went ahead and knit the entire sweater using that yarn. And do I wear this sweater now? No, I think I wore it maybe a few times, but I don't like how it feels next to your skin. There's also a few fit issues, but my main issue is that I don't like the texture of that yarn next to skin. So I just don't wear it, and therefore I regret that project. So that is my advice. Whenever possible, buy yarn in person, which also reinforces the point of good yarn doesn't mean expensive yarn, because I regret that yarn. It was like almost expensive, I would say, and I am much happier with some other choices I made that had a pretty cheaper price tag, I would say. And now let's talk about something else, but it's still yarn related. I've learned that a beautiful skein doesn't mean a beautiful fabric, and I find that especially true when it comes to hand-dyed yarn. I'm always seeing gorgeous variegated colorways of hand-dyed yarn on Instagram and sometimes in person when I travel and things like that. And they always look so stunning, but I've learned that usually I don't like the way the fabric looks with variegated yarn. And I'm not blaming the hand-dyed process, that's not it. What I'm saying is I just like something that looks different, you know? So sometimes I see a beautiful ball of yarn at the shop and I really try to restrain myself from buying it, because I know once this yarn has been knitted up, I probably won't like the fabric. And I'm not talking about softness or anything like that. I'm talking about the way variegated yarn looks when knitted up, especially if I'm working on something that has sleeves. because I work on a body and I have a certain amount of stitches on my needles, but when I switch to knitting the sleeves, I have what, a third of the number of stitches, so the way the fabric looks is usually different, and that bothers me to no end. So I've learned that before buying yarn, I need to make sure that I will like the fabric it will create. If I can see a swatch in person, that's perfect, but sometimes there aren't any swatches. I always try to look on Ravelry to see if other knitters used this same colorway and things like that before I buy the skein. Otherwise, I know there's a high chance that I will regret this once I finish my project. Which reminds me of always buy one extra ball of yarn if possible. I know that comes with an extra cost because you're buying more yarn, but I don't usually knit with hand-dyed yarn. I usually knit with commercially dyed, so there's a cost difference, I would say. But I've learned that I always buy one extra ball if I can, because I never know if I will want to make a modification, if I want to change my needle size, if I want to add length or change the color or do anything that would require more yarn in order to finish a project, and I don't like to play yarn chicken. That really takes all the joy away from a project for me, and so I avoid that whenever possible. And also, if I end up playing yarn chicken and I lose, which is what happened when I was working on my cushion that I mentioned, what if there's no yarn available anymore, or at least it's not the same dye lot? Then there would be the subtle color change at one point in the project that really bothers me to no end. I would have to come up with any other solution that would look intentional, so I try to avoid that at all costs. Otherwise, I know if I play yarn chicken and I lose, I will regret not buying one extra ball to no end. So that's my advice. And now let's go with the last topic I have on my little list, which is experiment without overwhelming yourself. And the first thing that comes to mind when I say this is when I'm experimenting with a new yarn, a new color, a new construction, I always try to match that with a simple project. For example, a while back I worked on a lime green sweater, and if you've been here a while, you know that lime green is so out of my comfort zone that I don't have anything in this color in my wardrobe. So I was trying to experiment with that. I ended up having a lot of fun and I wear my finished object all the time, but when I was casting it on, I didn't know that I would like it in the end. So in order to make my life easier and make it easy on me to like the final project, I chose a really simple project, just a stockinette sweater with a simple V neckline to add some visual interest, but the look of the sweater was still pretty simple because I knew that if I mixed this new to me color, a heavily textured pattern, I would pick on that. I would not wear that sweater at all because I would feel like there's just too much going on and it would just end up collecting dust in my closet. So every time I experiment with something, especially when it's a new to me color, I always try to match that with a simple project to maximize the chances of me liking it in the end. Otherwise, I know I will regret it. If I don't wear it, I regret it. Like I said, it's a cycle, you know. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't leave your comfort zone in 5 different ways at once. One time, a while back, I wanted to work on a vest. I never owned a vest. I didn't know if I would wear a vest if I had one. So I chose a really simple one, just plain stockinette with a little bow here on the side to just add a little touch of fun. I chose a color that I felt comfortable with, that was very much in my comfort zone, so that I just had one variable, which was it being a vest. So I think I maximized the chances of actually liking it in the end, and in fact I do. Do I wear it? Not much, because I don't really know how to style a vest, but surprisingly, when I look in the mirror, I actually like what I see. I like the way the vest looks on me. I like the fit and everything. So would I need another vest? Yes. Would I still keep it simple? Yes. Until I'm sure that a vest really fits into my wardrobe. I know how to style it with other pieces I have in my closet and all of those things. Because otherwise, let's say I needed a vest in lime green or heavily textured, full of cables, I would feel like a fish out of water and I wouldn't feel comfortable in that garment. You know, I hope you get what I'm trying to say here. And my last point is go bold with colors, but know yourself. I want to experiment with colors, so I choose a simple project. Or if I want to add stripes to a project and I want to go bold with my color choices, I choose a simple construction so that it's one last thing in my way to prevent me from wearing this project in the end. You know, I hope that makes sense. Bottom line is experiment wisely. That's what I learned from my knitting regrets, I would say. Don't play with too many variables at once so that you have a higher chance of liking your finished project and wearing it because, like I said, it is really important that I wear my finished objects. I've been talking non-stop, so now I will finish this swatch. Hopefully don't switch to stockinette stitch again, but I think that's all I can think of right now. I hope you got something from this video, and if you have any tips that you would like to share, leave them in the comments down below. I always love learning from fellow knitters, and if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe down below. It always helps the channel and I really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!